Welcome along to Critical Disability Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University. Very, very happy today in West Yorkshire to be able to have this opportunity to interview Fiona Kumari Campbell. Hi Fiona.
Hi Dan.
Can you remind us of your institutional location, please?
Yes, I'm at the Griffith Law School on sunny Gold Coast, part of Griffith University in Australia.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Right, Fiona, your book Contours of Ableism, very important text for many of us working in disability studies. The question I suppose some of us would ask though is that there we are focusing upon disablism, and you come along with a text which suggests we look at ableism. Why?
Well, I think, people with disabilities have been studied for several years now, in fact, several decades, and little has changed. In fact, you can argue that we're one of the most studied people in the world. I wanted the spotlight to be shone back on the producers of knowledge, to be put back on able-bodied people, or more importantly, the notion of abledness. And I think that because it's been such a robust, enduring concept in terms of practices and philosophy over a period of time, abledness seems to have had the capacity to reinvent itself, whether it be ableness vis-a-vis concepts of masculinity and femininity, ableness in terms of scientific racism, or in fact ableness in terms of its capacity to constantly hive off what it sees to be as the normal, as the perfect, as the powerful, and then obviously the pathological, the deficient, the riff-raff like me. And so I was very interested in it. Obviously, very clearly, it's a powerful ethos. That doesn't mean that disability's moved out of the picture, Dan, however, because I think clearly, as a disability studies scholar, which I situate myself as, and as a person with a disability, I'm really interested in how disability rubs up and against ableness and causes discomfort. And it's through some of the study of the very bizarre circumstances that people with disabilities find themselves in, whether it be through technology or indeed performances in law. Ableness is able to be unveiled. So that's been really the focus. So I think it's the objects of study can be similar, but maybe the preoccupations and the theoretical questions that are asked are somewhat different.
So am I right in thinking that studies of ableism are similar perhaps to some of the critical whiteness studies literature that's been developing over the last 10 to 15 years?
Well, I think so. I think, one of the dilemmas about this sort of stuff is that any kind of minoritisation, now I know that means different things in different places, is that we can tend to kind of create silos of knowledge or hive things off, and it falls into obviously identity politics. I think what I'm really interested in is that we know that disability has a history. To use those phrases, it's culturally contingent, historically contingent. There is no one disabled person who floats through history. And what I'm interested in then is, again, that kind of notion that it's impossible to have a concept of disability without a concept of ableness, is how is this fiction? I mean, it is in reality a fiction, this notion of the able-bodied person, the abled mind, the abled intellect, the abled emotion. How is this fiction endured over time when there are variations throughout the world? So I think, we live in an era, for example, where ableism is able to be teased and tested out, for example, in the development of international norms around, who is a disabled person, concepts of health. So it travels across a range of areas. We can now look, instead of just looking at disability, we can look at, well, what about the production of well-being? What about the production of beauty? How does it relate to other kinds of forms of marginality?
Right, so this seems to be, in many ways, then, a kind of a bit of shift in thinking that you're proposing for disability studies, in the sense that whilst important to study the conditions, for example, of disablism that lead to exclusion on the part of people with labels of impairment, what you're saying is let's move our attention away from that. Let us actually look at the kind of dominant hegemonic ideas around the body, around capacity, around behaviour.
Productivity,
right.
The productive citizen.
Right.
I think we've got this notion of what atomistic individualism, all these things that come into play. Even the notion, and I guess this is my own disciplinary background, but I think it can go beyond it, about who is a genuine disabled person. Why do we have problems about working outside of the parameters, these fixed fictional parameters of abled and disabled, where the reality is for most of us, we actually have a far greater fluid identity? Why are we, to quote Margaret Sheldrake, kind of having discomfort with this kind of notion of leakiness? And a lot of these issues come back to ableism. Some of the emergence in the area of fat studies, or if we want to study soma techniques and the techno body, or transhumanism. All these things have various kinds of links with the notion of ableness, which is it's so imprecise, and you actually see these systems which are about kind of very cordoned off, polarised benchmarks of what it means to be human.
Right.
And I could do it. I always have this joke, Jan, that in another world I could get into the veterinary philosophy of veterinary science too, because I think we can learn a lot about the study of animals, and even our very our demarcations, our anthropomorphic demarcations between the scaling of bodies and the scaling of realities can be hooked up in this area.
And one of the things I've picked up on in reading your lovely writing, and it is lovely writing, is the word precariousness, and that's the precariousness of the able-bodied, or the precariousness of the non-disabled citizen. And my understanding of that is that the ableism is impossible, ableist ideals are impossible, not only obviously for disabled people, but for everybody. Would that be a fair kind of interpretation of the word?
It's kind of like it's a philosophical version of ambulance chasing. Like you kind of except the ambulance is like you're not getting there. You've got the to use James Overbow's concept of normative shadows. It's kind of there. You're living under them, but it's the kind of thing like you're trying to get to the shadow. You're trying to get to the cloud, but you're not quite there. But it's a marker, and it's a marker that is persistive, it's compulsory, it's seductive. I think even people will often say, look, of course, I don't believe in these particular kind of ventures that are there, but the whole of science's budget, the whole cure issue. I think the thing is that, and this is where there's some very interesting kind of notions about cure and transitioning from one kind of corporeal state to another, that we keep playing, that people can move to this kind of state of perfection. The precariousness, I should say, is not about that rather banal, and I must say I find offensive argument that we're all really disabled. Of course, we're all disabled people in some ways, because they're kind of, I guess in hers, the kind of deficiency model. The precariousness talks about, I guess, the fact that actually if you unpack the notion of the body within an ableist trajectory, that in fact you'll find that in fact that things are not as straightforward. There's kind of cordoning off of the various status into abled and disabled. There's a fracturing. There's a frailty there. Precariousness also is, I think, a motif that I use in the disability experience, because I think that people with disabilities often live very precarious lives, which is far more of a powerful, realistic term than vulnerable lives, because that, for me, again, invokes passivity. But also, in many ways, and again, to kind of use the words of, I think it was Judith Snow, a Canadian activist, that goodwill should be no substitute for freedom. I think for most people with disabilities, all it needs to be is some support system or some policy change in government. It can alter the balance. Precariousness and ambivalence, I think, go together in an ableist world. But for the technology that's there to cure, or but for a change in government policy, people's capacity to move in a flourishing way is compromised.
Okay, so now we've kind of established the problems with ableism. What's the kind of alternative then? Where does this lead? When we expose, if you take a kind of very Lacanian view, the emptiness of the kind of ableist symbolic, the ableist culture, we can all recognise its complete emptiness and its fiction. Where does this leave activism?
Yeah. Where does it leave activism?
Yeah, disability activism.
Well, I think firstly that my work and all work is obviously situated within the cultural moment. So I'm very, I'm sociology trained, but I read a lot of cultural studies. I've been influenced by the work of queer theory, but also post-colonial studies. And I think what I'm really interested in, what ableism does is it closes off possibility. It closes off imagination. And that's the way you kill people, ontologically. That's so I think by actually providing a new ground, a kind of new phenomenological reality, hopefully we can then look then at people with disabilities expressing another way of the lived body, another imagination and another possibility. So I think that what will that do? I'm not sure, because we also know that that can up the ante, because certainly from my own studies where people with disabilities have attempted to present counter stories, those counter stories have been somewhat nullified, or they've been recuperated. But I think I'm very much, my next step in my own work, I must say, is influenced by one of your UK folk, actually a theologian by the name of Grace M. Jansen, who did some really interesting postmodern work around violence and theology, and her work that she was undertaking before her premature death was about this notion of natality and becoming and flourishing. So my sense in many ways is I don't want to presume what will come out of this. Can I say, however, we should not underestimate the fact that each of us are implicated in ableist thinking, and in fact particularly internalised ableism. And I think, like with the work that you're doing at the moment, I think that it's important for us to at least get our detective lenses and our detective manuals out and really interrogate that kind of ontology of able-bodiedness. And it's by rooting it out and kind of unveiling that which is hidden. There's something I think very powerful about putting that on the table. So I think one of the things that the challenges are, to your question, are with ableism, and in particular internalised ableism, is to study the way in which ableism entitles certain populations. What do they get out of it? How does it make them flourish? Because ableism has benefits. On the other hand, to look at then, well, how does ableism and its internalisation denigrate and diminish possibility? And then obviously looking at notions of resistance as well. It's a really tough one. It potentially can destabilise the whole kind of integration project and this whole kind of, I don't know whether it's strong here, Dan, but the whole kind of project of social inclusion, because it's still very much an assimilationist model, certainly in Australia. And I take heart from a 1972 Japanese movie called ICP. I don't know whether you've seen that one. And that's about a Japanese activist group in 1972. And there's a lovely scene with one of the activist leaders who says, well, we're outsiders. We've always been outsiders. And he was talking about other activists. And he said, as soon as disabled people see themselves as outsiders, that point of separation can actually be a point of liberation. So I guess the difficulty about this is, obviously I'm not suggesting that we should decline from activism. I think that it should shape our activism. I think what we find, mind you, is most people with disabilities, and I include myself in it, to a greater or lesser extent, have bought into the project of, if we do this, we'll be okay.
Right.
And if we jump through the hoops, all will be well. But what we find, in fact, is that, and certainly from my own work and my work currently looking at reasonable adjustment in the workplaces, is that whilst, yes, you can get in the door, what we find is a magnification of tensions.
Right.
And the cost is, for many people with disabilities, is still a slap in the face personal cost.
Yeah.
So part of our work on ableism, I think, will help to developing strategies of resilience with people with disabilities, and also obviously strategies of resistance.
I was reminded when you were talking there of Paul Hunt's fantastic chapter in the book that he edited, where he talks about the idea that disabled people should not worry about the fact that they are seen as kind of incapable within the dominant culture, but actually celebrates their differences.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
that seems to be kind of where
Very
you're
prophetic.
going around in terms of activism.
Yeah, I think celebrating it. One of the things I'm really interested in, and look, and you can't. Sometimes there's some bodies of knowledge you can't automatically move across. But I think that certainly the most interesting conversations I've had have been around, some of the ways in which people express queer theory, for example, where, we're as boring as batshit as you. I don't know whether you can say that on your video thing, but I just said it, and I've seen ads, there's a classic YouTube ad of these two gay men sitting on a couch and watching the rugby, and it kind of said, equal rights for homosexuals because we're as boring as you. So do we want to go down that line with, disabled people? In fact, it's even worse with disability. In Australia, we say, well, they're more compliant. Hire a disabled person in the workforce because they're not going to be like uppity unionists and all this kind of hoopla. So if you turn away from that, so actually we're kind of, we're the whole kind of mixed kind of kit and caboodle, upstarts, uppity and whatever. What does that do? So there's one frame there. I think the other interesting thing, and that's where I think, studies in ableism opens up other areas of knowledge that we may not have taken in. Some of my best conversations, I must say, are with a colleague of mine who does a lot of work around transgender issues and the transgendered body, and they're provocative conversations. But I think, and my concern is we always have to watch resisting new forms of normativity,
right,
even within the alternative sphere. So, there's a whole queer normativity. I think, we run the risk in the disability area of having kind of a disability normativity where we celebrate the hero, but it's still a very contrived version. I think I'm more interested in the tension points, and I said to you, that notions of exploring that notion of precariousness. What does it mean? Notions of shame, notions of failure. I noticed that Judith Jack Halberstam's just put out a new book on the art of failure. I think some of these kind of, maybe more morose areas of knowledge can shed some light in this area, because I think humans have shown that they're not just resilient. We're very creative in refashioning ourselves.
Fiona Kumari Campbell, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.